Fake HOA cops targeted a veterans memorial garden. He's a retired colonel. This is the memorial garden of Colonel James Jim Carter, a retired Army veteran in Texas who built this sacred space to honor his fallen comrades. Every rose, every name on this plaque represents a soldier he served with, a brother or sister he lost. But a group of fake HOA cops showed up, called it an unauthorized structure, and tried to bulldoze it, disrespecting the memory of those who gave their lives. They didn't know Jim is a retired colonel with 30 years of military strategy and a network of veterans who'd fight for him. This is HOA Karen Files, where we expose the bullies who target the brave. Ever had a fake HOA disrespect something sacred to you? Share your story in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell for more. Let's dive into how Jim defended this garden and turned the tables on these scammers. Colonel James Jim Carter, a 68-year-old retired Army veteran, lived in a modest ranch-style house in a quiet suburb of San Antonio, Texas. The house was simple, white siding, a wraparound porch, and a neatly trimmed lawn, but the backyard was a masterpiece. There, Jim had spent the last 5 years building a memorial garden to honor the soldiers he'd served with during his 30-year military career. The garden was a labor of love, a sacred space where Jim could remember the men and women who'd fought beside him, many of whom never made it home. At the center stood a flagpole, the American flag flying proudly, its colors vivid against the Texas sky. Surrounding the flagpole were rows of red roses, their blooms vibrant and meticulously cared for, each bush planted in memory of a fallen comrade. A stone plaque sat at the base of the flagpole, engraved with the names of 12 soldiers Jim had lost over the years, friends, brothers, sisters in arms. A wooden bench faced the plaque, a place where Jim would sit every evening, a cup of black coffee in hand, reflecting on the sacrifices made by those he'd served with. Jim had joined the Army at 18, straight out of high school in a small Texas town, driven by a sense of duty and a desire to serve his country. He rose through the ranks over 3 decades, serving in conflicts from the Gulf War to Afghanistan, earning a Bronze Star for his leadership under fire. He'd seen more than most, battlefields stained with blood, the faces of young soldiers who'd never see their families again, the weight of command in moments of life and death. When he retired at 62, a colonel with a chest full of medals, he returned to San Antonio to live a quieter life. But the memories of his fallen comrades never left him. "I made a promise," he'd often say, his voice gruff but steady. "I told them I'd never forget. This garden, it's my way of keeping that promise." The garden wasn't just a tribute. It was a community space. Jim's neighbors, many of whom had veterans in their own families, often visited, bringing their kids to learn about the soldiers whose names were on the plaque. On Memorial Day and Veterans Day, Jim would host small ceremonies, inviting the neighborhood to join him in raising the flag and sharing stories about the fallen. "This is for Tommy," he'd say, pointing to a rose bush as he told the story of a young private who died saving his squad in Iraq. "And this is for Maria," he'd add, gesturing to another, recounting the bravery of a medic who'd given her life in Afghanistan. The kids would listen wide-eyed, their parents wiping away tears, the garden a living testament to the cost of freedom. On a warm September afternoon, Jim was in the garden, pruning the roses with a pair of shears, the scent of the blooms filling the air. He wore his usual outfit, faded jeans, a gray Army t-shirt, and a baseball cap with his unit's insignia. The sun was high, the sky a brilliant blue, and Jim hummed an old marching tune as he worked, his hands steady despite the arthritis that had crept into his joints. He was thinking about adding a new rose bush for a soldier named Daniel, a young sergeant who'd passed away just a year ago from injuries sustained in combat, when he heard the sound of a car pulling into his driveway. He set down his shears, wiping his hands on a rag, and walked around to the front of the house, his brow furrowing as he saw a black SUV with tinted windows. 3 people stepped out, all wearing black vests with HOA compliance in bold white letters. The leader, a man in his 50s named Richard Hayes, carried a clipboard and a camera, snapping photos of Jim's property without asking. The other 2, a woman named Linda and a younger man named Greg, followed close behind, their expressions stern. Richard approached Jim, his voice clipped and authoritative. "Mr. Carter, your backyard structure is in violation of Lone Star HOA regulations. he said, handing Jim a letter stamped with a fake logo. That garden and flagpole are unauthorized. You need to remove them within 72 hours or pay a $5,000 fine. Failure to comply will result in demolition. Jim's jaw tightened, his military training kicking in as he assessed the situation. Lone Star HOA, he said, his voice calm but edged with steel. I've lived here 10 years. There's no HOA in this neighborhood. This garden is a memorial for fallen soldiers. You're on private property, and I'm asking you to leave. Richard smirked, his eyes cold. Lone Star HOA was established last year, he said, his tone dripping with condescension. You're under our jurisdiction now. Pay the fine, or we'll be back with a crew to tear it down. Linda stepped forward, her camera flashing as she took photos of the garden, the roses, the plaque. Greg, the younger man, walked over to the flagpole and gave it a shake, testing its stability, his disrespect evident in his careless movements. This thing's an eyesore, he muttered, loud enough for Jim to hear. Jim's hands clenched into fists, his heart pounding with a mix of anger and disbelief. He'd faced enemies on the battlefield, but this was a different kind of fight. Get off my property, he said, his voice low and commanding, the kind of tone that had once rallied troops under fire. Now, the group laughed, a cruel, mocking sound that echoed through the quiet afternoon. You've got 72 hours, old man, Richard said, before they got back in their SUV and drove off, leaving Jim standing in his driveway, the letter crumpled in his hand. He walked back to the garden, his steps heavy, and sat on the bench, staring at the plaque. The names seemed to blur as his eyes filled with tears, not of fear, but of rage. This garden was sacred, a tribute to the soldiers he'd loved like family. He thought of Tommy, Maria, Daniel, all the names on that plaque, all the lives lost. They're not touching this garden, he said to himself, his voice a vow. Not while I'm still breathing. Jim knew he had the skills, the experience, and the network to fight back. He'd spent 30 years strategizing against enemies far more dangerous than these scammers. It was time to go to war. That evening, Jim sat at his kitchen table, a map of the neighborhood spread out in front of him, a notepad filled with names and numbers. He made a series of calls, his voice steady as he reached out to his network of veterans, men and women he'd served with, who'd answer his call without hesitation. I need your help, he told each one, explaining the situation. They're trying to destroy a memorial for our brothers and sisters. We can't let that happen. By the end of the night, he had a plan and a team ready to execute it. The fake HOA cops had no idea who they were dealing with. Jim Carter didn't waste a moment after the fake HOA cops left his property. He knew from his years in the military that the key to any successful operation was preparation, intelligence, and a well-coordinated team. Sitting at his kitchen table, the letter from Lone Star HOA in front of him, he studied it with the same intensity he'd once used to analyze enemy movements. The logo looked official, but Jim noticed the details. The cheap paper, the slightly off-center stamp, the generic email address, compliance@lonestaroa.org, mailtocompliance@lonestaroa.org. He'd dealt with enough bureaucracy in the Army to know what a real official document looked like, and this wasn't it. Amateurs, he muttered, a grim smile crossing his face. He picked up his phone and called his first ally, Captain Maria Alvarez, a retired intelligence officer who'd served under him in Afghanistan. Maria, now 55, lived just an hour away in Austin and ran a small cybersecurity firm. Jim, it's been too long, she said, her voice warm but concerned as he explained the situation. A fake HOA targeting a memorial garden? That's low, even for scammers. I'll dig into this Lone Star HOA. Give me a few hours. Maria got to work, using her skills to trace the domain. She found that Lonestaroa.org was registered just 4 months ago to a shell company called Horizon Property Group, with a P.O. box in Dallas. A quick search of county records confirmed what Jim suspected. There was no Lone Star HOA registered in San Antonio. It's a scam, Maria told him over the phone, her voice sharp with anger. Horizon Property Group has ties to a developer, Texas Sun Builders, known for shady land grabs. They've been targeting properties in your area, trying to force people out so they can build a strip mall. Jim's next call was to Major Tom Reynolds, a 60-year-old retired logistics officer who lived in Houston. Tom had a knack for organizing resources, a skill he'd honed during deployments when supplies were scarce. I need boots on the ground, Jim told him. We're setting up a perimeter around the garden, and I want to catch these guys in the act. Tom didn't hesitate. I'll round up the crew, he said. We'll be there by morning. True to his word, Tom arrived at Jim's house at dawn, bringing with him a team of 5 veterans, men and women who'd served with Jim over the years, all eager to defend the memorial garden. There was Sarah, a former sniper with a sharp eye, Carlos, a combat engineer who knew how to set up surveillance, and Emily, a medic who'd saved Jim's life during a firefight in Iraq. They gathered in Jim's living room, their faces a mix of determination and camaraderie, the kind of bond forged in the crucible of war. Jim briefed the team, laying out his plan with the precision of a military operation. We're dealing with scammers who think they can intimidate an old man, he said, his voice steady. They're coming back in 72 hours, and we'll be ready. Carlos, I want cameras around the garden, hidden, but with clear angles. Sarah, you're on lookout. I need eyes on the street. Emily, you'll coordinate with the local police. I've got a contact there who can help. Tom, you and I will handle the confrontation. Maria's working on the intel, and she'll have more for us soon. We're not just protecting the garden. We're taking these bastards down. The team nodded, their training kicking in, their loyalty to Jim unwavering. They spent the day setting up, installing small security cameras in the trees around the garden, their lenses trained on the flagpole and plaque. Sarah positioned herself on the roof with a pair of binoculars, her vantage point giving her a clear view of the street. Emily met with Officer Daniel Martinez, a San Antonio PD officer who'd served in the National Guard and respected Jim's service. We'll have a team on standby, Daniel promised. Just give us the signal. While the team prepared, Jim reached out to his neighbors, knocking on doors to explain the situation. He stood on their porches, his cap in hand, his voice calm, but firm as he told them about the fake HOA and the threat to the garden. This isn't just about me, he said. This garden is for all of us. It's for every soldier who didn't come home. I need your support. The neighbors, many of whom had attended Jim's Memorial Day ceremonies, were outraged. Mrs. Lopez, a 70-year-old widow whose son had served in the Navy, offered to bake cookies for the veterans helping Jim. Mr. Thompson, a retired teacher, promised to spread the word on the neighborhood's Facebook group, rallying more support. By the end of the day, a small crowd had gathered in Jim's backyard, bringing lawn chairs and thermoses of coffee, determined to stand with him. We're not letting them touch that garden, Mrs. Lopez said, her voice fierce. Jim nodded, his heart swelling with gratitude. He'd fought for his country, and now his community was fighting for him. On the third day, as the 72-hour deadline approached, Jim and his team were ready. The garden was quiet, the roses glowing in the morning light, the flags snapping in the breeze. Jim stood by the flagpole, his posture straight, his eyes scanning the street. Sarah's voice crackled through a walkie-talkie. Black SUV approaching, 3 occupants. It's them. Jim's jaw tightened, his military instincts kicking in. He signaled to Carlos, who started the cameras, and to Emily, who called Officer Martinez. The neighbors stood behind Jim, their faces a mix of anger and resolve, their presence a silent show of support. Richard, Linda, and Greg stepped out of the SUV, their vests on, their expressions smug. Richard carried a megaphone, his voice booming as he approached the garden. "Time's up, Carter," he shouted. "Pay the $5,000, or we're tearing this down, starting with that flagpole." Greg grabbed a pair of bolt cutters, moving toward the flagpole as if to cut it down, while Linda started taking more photos, her camera flashing. Jim stepped forward, his voice calm but commanding, the kind of tone that had once stopped soldiers in their tracks. "You're on camera," he said, pointing to the trees where the cameras were hidden. "And I know you're not a real HOA. Horizon Property Group, Texas Sun Builders, I've got your whole operation figured out. You're scammers, and you're not touching this garden." Richard's smirk faltered, but he tried to bluff. "You can't prove anything," he said, his voice less confident. That's when Officer Martinez and his team moved in, sirens blaring as 3 police cars surrounded the SUV. "San Antonio PD," Martinez shouted, his badge out. "You're under arrest for extortion, vandalism, and impersonating an HOA." The neighbors cheered as Richard, Linda, and Greg were handcuffed, their smug expressions replaced with panic. Jim watched, his arms crossed, a quiet satisfaction in his eyes. "You picked the wrong garden to mess with," he said, his voice low. The cameras had captured everything, and Jim knew this was just the beginning of the fight. With Richard, Linda, and Greg in custody, Officer Martinez and his team at the San Antonio Police Department began unraveling the scam. The footage from Jim's cameras was damning, showing the group's threats and Greg's attempt to cut down the flagpole, a clear act of vandalism. Maria Alvarez, Jim's intelligence officer, sent over her findings on Horizon Property Group, linking it to Texas Sun Builders, a developer with a history of aggressive land acquisition tactics. The police raided Horizon's P.O. box in Dallas, uncovering a treasure trove of evidence: fake HOA letters, lists of targeted properties, and financial records showing over $50,000 in extorted fines from homeowners across San Antonio. The operation was led by a man named Eddie Monroe, a 48-year-old with a rap sheet for fraud and embezzlement, who'd partnered with Texas Sun Builders to clear land for a strip mall project. Jim's confrontation with the fake HOA cops had been live-streamed by one of his neighbors, a teenager named Ethan, who'd posted the video to TikTok with the caption, "Veteran shuts down fake HOA trying to destroy Memorial Garden. #Justice for Colonel Jim." The video went viral, racking up 5 million views in 24 hours, shared across platforms by veterans groups, military families, and patriotic organizations. Hashtags like #Justice for Colonel Jim and #Save the Memorial Garden trended nationwide, with comments flooding in. "This is disgusting. How dare they? Colonel Jim is a hero. We need to protect our veterans." A local news station, KSAT 12, picked up the story, interviewing Jim in his garden, the flagpole and roses in the background. "This garden is for my brothers and sisters who didn't come home," Jim said, his voice steady but emotional. These scammers thought they could disrespect their memory. They were wrong. The viral attention brought more victims forward. Over 20 homeowners in San Antonio reported similar experiences with Lone Star HOA, including a 75-year-old woman named Mrs. Rivera, who'd paid $2,000 to avoid losing her shed, and a young couple who'd been harassed into selling their home after fake fines for their kid's playset. "They kept coming back," the husband told KSAT, his voice shaking. "We couldn't take it anymore." Jim's heart ached as he heard their stories, his resolve hardening. He hosted a meeting in his backyard, inviting the victims to share their experiences, the garden a fitting backdrop for their collective fight. "We're not just saving this garden," Jim told them, his voice strong. "We're saving our homes, our memories, our community." The neighbors nodded, their faces a mix of anger and hope, ready to stand with Jim. Maria's investigation uncovered a larger network. Texas Sun Builders was part of a conglomerate, Sunbelt Development, which had similar operations in 5 other states: Florida, Arizona, Nevada, Georgia, and North Carolina. "This is bigger than San Antonio," Maria told Jim over the phone, her voice urgent. "Eddie Monroe is just a middleman. Sunbelt is the real player. They've been doing this for years, targeting veterans, seniors, anyone they think won't fight back." Jim's jaw tightened, his military mind already strategizing. "Then we take it to the feds," he said. He called a contact at the FBI, a former Army buddy named Agent Mark Sullivan, who worked in the white-collar crime division. "Mark, I've got a case for you," Jim said, sending over Maria's files. "These guys are preying on veterans. They need to be stopped." Mark promised to escalate the case, coordinating with the San Antonio PD to build a federal indictment. The community support for Jim grew stronger with every passing day. Veterans groups across Texas rallied, organizing a Stand for the Garden event in Jim's backyard, where over 100 veterans showed up in uniform, saluting the flag and sharing stories of their own fallen comrades. The event was live-streamed on Facebook, drawing thousands of viewers, many of whom donated to a GoFundMe set up by Ethan to help Jim expand the garden. The campaign raised $20,000, with donations from as far away as Germany and Japan, where soldiers who'd served with Jim sent messages of support. "You were my CO in Iraq," wrote a former private from Japan. "You saved my life. Now I'm helping save your garden." Jim used the money to add a new section to the garden, a small fountain with a plaque honoring all veterans, a place for the community to reflect and heal. Back in the garden, Jim planted the new rose bush for Daniel, the sergeant who'd passed away the previous year. He worked slowly, his hands steady as he dug the hole, the scent of the earth grounding him. The neighbors gathered around, watching in silence, their presence a quiet show of support. "This is for you, Danny," Jim said, placing the rose bush in the ground, his voice thick with emotion. "We're keeping your memory alive." Mrs. Lopez handed him a tissue, her own eyes misty, and the group shared a moment of silence, the flag above them waving gently in the breeze. Jim knew the fight wasn't over, but he also knew he wasn't alone. The legal battle against Horizon Property Group and Texas Sun Builders moved swiftly, thanks to the evidence Jim and his team had gathered. The San Antonio PD, working with the FBI, raided Texas Sun Builders' headquarters in Dallas, seizing computers, financial records, and email chains that detailed the scam. The evidence was overwhelming. Eddie Monroe had been running the operation for 2 years, extorting over $100,000 from homeowners across Texas, with Texas Sun Builders taking a cut of the profits to fund their strip mall project. The FBI expanded the investigation, uncovering Sunbelt Development's operations in 5 other states, leading to a federal indictment for racketeering, wire fraud, and conspiracy. Jim's story became a rallying cry for veterans and military families across the country. The viral TikTok video of the confrontation, combined with the KSAT 12 news segment, caught the attention of national outlets like Fox News and CNN, with headlines like "Retired Colonel Defends Memorial Garden from Fake HOA Scam" and "Veterans Fight Exposes Real Estate Fraud." Jim was invited to speak at a Veterans of Foreign Wars (VFW) convention in Austin, where he shared his story with a crowd of 500 veterans. "They thought they could disrespect our fallen," he said, his voice echoing through the hall, the flagpole from his garden projected on a screen behind him. "But we showed them what happens when you mess with a soldier's memory." The audience gave him a standing ovation, many saluting as Jim stepped off the stage, his chest tight with emotion. Back in San Antonio, the community turned Jim's garden into a symbol of resistance. Local veterans groups organized weekly visits, bringing their families to pay respects at the plaque, the garden becoming a pilgrimage site for those who'd served. A group of high school students, inspired by Jim's story, started a Veterans Voices project, interviewing Jim and other local vets to document their stories, which they published in a book sold to raise money for the garden. "Colonel Jim taught us what honor looks like," one of the students, a 17-year-old named Mia, told KSAT during a follow-up story. "We want to make sure no one forgets." The book raised $5,000, which Jim used to add a small gazebo to the garden, a shaded spot for visitors to sit and reflect. The trial against Eddie Monroe was a media frenzy, with Jim testifying as the key witness. He sat on the stand, his posture straight, his Army medals pinned to his jacket, his voice steady as he recounted the day of the confrontation. "They threatened to bulldoze a memorial for fallen soldiers," he said, his eyes locked on Eddie, who sat at the defense table, his face pale. "They disrespected the memory of men and women who gave their lives for this country. I couldn't let that stand." The prosecution played the footage from Jim's cameras, the jury watching in silence as Greg approached the flagpole with bolt cutters, Richard's threats booming through the megaphone. The evidence was irrefutable, and after a 3-day trial, the jury found Eddie guilty on all counts, sentencing him to 12 years in prison. Richard, Linda, and Greg took plea deals, testifying against Eddie in exchange for 4-year sentences each, with orders to pay restitution to the victims. Texas Sun Builders settled a civil lawsuit for $3 million, with the money distributed among the victims. Jim used his share to establish a small scholarship fund for children of veterans in San Antonio, naming it the Fallen Heroes Fund. "I want their kids to have the opportunities they fought for," he said at the fund's launch, cutting the ribbon with a pair of ceremonial scissors, the garden packed with supporters. The fund awarded its first scholarship, a $2,000 grant, to Mia, the high school student who'd led the Veterans Voices project, helping her attend college to study history. "Thank you, Colonel Jim," she said, hugging him, her eyes shining with gratitude. The aftermath of the trial had a ripple effect. Sunbelt Development was hit with a $5 million fine, its assets seized to compensate victims across the country, and the FBI's investigation led to dozens of arrests in other states. Lawmakers in Texas introduced a bill called Carter's Law, making it a felony to impersonate an HOA with intent to defraud, with specific protections for veterans and seniors. Colonel Jim Carter showed us what's at stake, a state representative said at a press conference, holding up a photo of Jim in his garden. We're fighting for every memorial, every home, every memory out there. In the years that followed, Jim's memorial garden became a beacon of honor and healing, not just for San Antonio, but for veterans across the country. The garden grew, with Jim adding new rose bushes for fallen soldiers as their families reached out, asking to be included. Each planting was a ceremony, with Jim and the community gathering to share stories, the flag raised in salute, the scent of roses filling the air. The gazebo became a gathering spot, where veterans would sit and talk, their voices low as they shared memories of their service, the garden a safe space to heal from the wounds of war, both visible and invisible. Jim's story inspired a wave of activism among veterans groups, who used his fight to advocate for stronger protections against real estate scams. The VFW launched a national campaign, Protect Our Heroes, distributing flyers with tips on spotting fake HOAs and reporting fraud, with Jim's garden as the centerpiece. Colonel Jim Carter fought for our fallen. The campaign's slogan read, "Now we fight for him, and for every veteran." The campaign led to new laws in 10 states, with Carter's Law becoming a model for legislation nationwide. Advocacy groups for seniors also joined the cause, using Jim's story to highlight the vulnerability of older homeowners, ensuring that protections extended to all. The community around Jim's house became a family, their bond forged in the fight to save the garden. Neighbors started a Veterans Day of Service, where they'd volunteer to maintain the garden, planting new flowers, cleaning the plaque, and raising the flag, their kids learning the names of the soldiers as they worked. The high school students who'd started the Veterans Voices project expanded it, creating a podcast where they interviewed veterans across Texas, their stories reaching thousands of listeners. Colonel Jim showed us the power of one voice, Mia said on the podcast's first episode, her voice clear and confident. He taught us to honor the past by fighting for the future. Jim, now 71, continued to tend the garden, his hands slower, but his spirit as strong as ever. On the 5th anniversary of the incident, he held a special ceremony, inviting the community, his veteran team, Officer Martinez, and the families of the fallen soldiers named on the plaque. The garden was packed, with over 200 people gathered, the flagpole at the center, the roses in full bloom. They unveiled a new addition, a bronze statue of a soldier saluting, a gift from the VFW, with a plaque that read, "In honor of Colonel Jim Carter and the fallen heroes of the Memorial Garden." "This garden isn't just mine," Jim said, his voice thick with emotion as he addressed the crowd. "It's ours, a place to remember, to heal, to fight for what's right. Thank you for standing with me." The crowd cheered, many saluting, the flag above them waving proudly. As the sun set, Jim sat on the bench, a cup of coffee in hand, watching the families gather around the statue, their voices a soft hum of gratitude. He thought about the day the fake HOA cops had tried to take the garden, the fear, the anger, the uncertainty. But he also thought about what had come after, the strength of his community, the justice they'd won, the legacy they'd built. "We kept our promise," he whispered, looking at the plaque, the names of his fallen comrades glowing in the fading light. The garden stood as a testament to their sacrifice, and to the power of a soldier who refused to let their memory be disrespected. Colonel Jim Carter turned this memorial garden into a symbol of honor, a place where the memory of fallen soldiers lives on. 5 years ago, fake HOA cops thought they could bulldoze this sacred space, disrespecting the sacrifices of those who gave their lives. They didn't know Jim was a retired colonel with 30 years of military strategy, and a community of veterans and neighbors who'd fight for him. Now his garden is a beacon of healing, a legacy of justice, and the inspiration for Carter's Law, protecting veterans across the country. This is HOA Karen Files, where we shine a light on the brave who refuse to back down. Have you or someone you know been targeted by a fake HOA? Tell me in the comments. I read every one. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you don't miss the next story. We'll see you soon, and let's keep honoring those who fight for us.